to make sure that we can enter into a world that is more shock-free than it used to be. Because globalization is fine, but to some extent create artificial value.
Today, I have the pleasure to welcome in the studio Bruno Colmant, who is economist and has a long career in Belgium and also in Luxembourg. Welcome.
Thank you.
I saw you presenting at the ALFI conference, and this is why I invited you. You have a way to explain today's economy by referring to the history of the economy. So maybe we can start with the first question. How did the Western world economic models evolved since the end of the Second World War?
Well, thank you for welcoming me today. To answer this question, we have to take a dive into the 30s, just after the market crash of 29. What happened at that time was a huge unemployment wave, depression, recession, sometimes inflation, and the answer that was given by monetary authorities was the wrong one. Instead of giving liquidity to the banking world, they decided to cut on liquidity. That created what we call today the Great Depression, and the economic theories changed at that time, adopting the so-called Keynesian approach. Keynes was an English economist, and the man made a statement that when an economy was suffering, the idea was to push demand and not the offer. So his idea was that the government was supposed to help stimulating the economy, and that's what happened in the US. Through the New Deals entertained by President Roosevelt. The Keynesian spirit evolved throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, thanks also to the monetary agreement called the Bretton Woods Agreement that were signed off in 1944. And the idea was that all currencies would be linked to each other through a gold wave. So the parities were the same across most developed economies. So that helped to grow, that helped to resolve unemployment, and we had what people call today 30 years of prosperity that the Americans call the golden 60s. In the 70s, a major shock took place because the US decided to withdraw from the Bretton Woods agreements, and the reason for that was that there was not enough gold to ensure that the conversion of the dollar into gold would be possible by the Federal Reserve. And the reason for that is that when you have the reserve currency of the world, you give your own liquidity to the rest of the world. And it means that at some point in time, without any doubt, you issue more US dollars than your gold reserves. That's exactly what happened. So the US decided to move away from these agreements. That led to a huge wave of inflation, depreciation at the same time. So all parities started to be, I would say, dismantled. And we had the ugly 70s when at the same time there was unemployment and inflation.
It was the same in Luxembourg. There was
yes.
the oil crisis. The steel industry was a
yes.
mono industry here.
Yes.
Tens of thousands of people lost their job, and I think the state did exactly what you described before. They hired those people and got them to do take care of parks and painting houses just to keep them busy.
Absolutely. So we had multiple issues at the same time. So unemployment, recession, inflation, a huge increase of public debts, and under the Keynesian theory, having at the same time inflation and unemployment would not happen. It was called at the time stagflation, that is for stagnation and inflation. Mm-hmm. And so most European governments were unable to find a solution. Sometimes they were pushing on demand, sometimes they were fighting inflation. And eventually what happened is that the US decided in 81 to fight inflation almost at any price. Mm-hmm. They increased interest rates. So at the time in the US, inflation was above 10%. Rates were pushed above 20% mm-hmm. for a couple of weeks. And in 2 or 3 years, inflation went down to 3 or 4%. But that meant at the time that they created a huge depression for other countries. But that was the start of what we call today neoliberalism. So neoliberalism was I would say, initiated by inflation in the 70s. We can talk about the last, let's say, 45 years. During these years, we had a change of the mood of the economy, meaning that most government would decide to deregulate and to make as if the economy was close to financial markets. We call that today market economy. Market economy doesn't mean capitalism. It means that the economy can be run like a stock market with rational agents, without any friction, without taxes. So the mood changed, and it got amplified by the globalization. And the real globalization took place in December 2001 when China joined the World Trade Organization. We had, I would say, a global market economy. But when you enter into such an economy, at the same time, you create volatility. Because it's all about borrowing the future. When you borrow the future, you amplify the volatility of the economy. And so we had several crises, the internet crisis 25 years ago. We had, of course, the huge subprime crisis in 2008, so the sovereign crisis in 2009-11. And since then, we see that the world, is growing, still growing, but that the level of globalization has been so high that most people are pushing back on globalization, as if too much globalization would kill globalization. And we see that happening everywhere. We saw that during the COVID crisis, of course. We saw deglobalization. And that's a very important point to highlight, because about 50% of the stock market increase of the last 20 years can be linked to globalization, meaning that if you deglobalize the world, you take away, or you wipe out part of the stock market, I would say, increase. Of course, you will not deglobalize down to the level it was 20 years ago, but if you take away, I would say, 20 or 25% of globalization, you can see stock prices going down by 15 or 20%.
Yeah, and I see some companies, I'm thinking German car dealers are waking up to a value which incorporates what they sell in Germany, in Europe, but also in China.
Absolutely.
And when the tariffs are coming from Trump, for example, of course, the whole value is at risk.
So, and Trump came, of course, 9 years ago. He came back almost a year ago with the idea that America, the US, should be free from any constraints linked to globalization and even linked to the institutions that got created after the war, like the IMF, like the World Bank, and is creating a kind of a disorder across the economy. The purpose of this disorder can be seen with multiple eyes. One could see this as value destruction, but other people, and I'm one of them, could see this is a way to rethink the world. And to make sure that we can enter into a world that is more shock-free than it used to be. Because globalization is fine, but to some extent create artificial value. Because it's as if you would make the postulate that the economy would keep on growing without any border, any frontier. When you deglobalize, you have to rethink your own business case, and that's probably what's happening across most countries today. So we are today entering into a new world where we will see major superpowers emerging or re-emerging, like the US, but of course China. And we see that the world also is going to be separated into several subcomponents. There will be the US, of course, Europe progressively being bifurcated from the US. We see, by the way, Europe being attacked by Russia. And we see also China and some of the countries that are pushing back on the Western model, because their claim is that we considered for too long these countries, their own countries like China, as colonies, and that we, the Western world, made money with money without working anymore, which is maybe not untrue. And Europe is, of course, in a very difficult position, because we used to benefit from the military protection from the US, from cheap energy coming from Russia. We benefited from the openness of the Chinese market. All these things are being today dismantled or even disappearing, which means that Europe is at stake, fighting with the US, fighting with Russia, commercially fighting with China, and even within Europe, there is a deep disagreement about the future model that could unify the almost 30 countries composing the EU. So this is the situation today. So it means that the year 25 is a year of rethinking the world.
Yeah, and it's also a wake-up call for Europe. We always consider it was created in 57 in Rome, but actually I had an interview recently with Mr. Goebbels, who was Minister of Economy from 89 to 99 in Luxembourg, and he basically told me, no, the birth of Europe is more when the Berlin Wall fell, because before that Europe was just a few diplomats meeting and having lunch together. When the wall fell, that created the possibility of a euro. So if we think like this, now Europe is only 25 years old, and if we look at the map, sadly there's a lot of extremes already on the map, going from Italy to of course Austria, Czechoslovakia, Finland.
Yes.
It's a mess.
Well, it's a mess, but the point is true. What happened 25 years ago is that the euro got created. It was decided, of course, as we all know, in 91, 92. But the euro got created because Germany could be reunified. And today, if the euro would not have existed, the EU would be in a very bad shape. Because one could argue that the euro is holding Europe together. Even if some countries, like Poland, like Hungary, are not part of the Eurozone, but still we see that the euro makes business easier among EU members. And when the business is doing fine, normally you achieve peace, among countries.
And Philipp Rösler was here 3 weeks ago. He was a former Vice Chancellor, Minister of Economy of Germany. And it was interesting when I talked to him that he was saying, okay, it's very nice that we have 27 francs or 26 francs, but in reality, Germany and France are really the engine. And this is, I think, a big risk right now for Europe, that we see the most powerful members basically doing some, make my country great again, instead of this very nice vision for Europe. So in this context, of course, we've seen through Ukraine the birth of a bipolar world. It used to be American-centric. Now, of course, we had the BRICS, but it was not much. Now we see a long list of new members already being accepted or queuing to join the BRICS. My question, I'm not an economist, is how do you see the dollar evolving in a bipolar world, and what are the risks?
Well, when we adopted the gold standard in July 44, the idea was that it was a dollar standard, because the dollar was supposed to be the #1 reserve currency. And thanks to the development of the Western world, the dollar became stronger and stronger year by year. And still today, the US dollar is being used for 60% of international trade. It's used, and it's not unimportant, as the currency for oil prices, very important. By the way, that's why we had a oil crisis in 74 and 79. But what's happening with the US dollar is that it used to be, I would say, guaranteed by the US military.
Okay.
The US military, still today, as we saw with Iran, is able to intervene almost everywhere around the world. But there are several dangers for the US dollar. The first one is that the US public debt is becoming too important and to some extent not sustainable anymore. And second, if the US become more and more isolationist, then of course there will be a contradiction between the US dollar being the reserve currency of the world and the US becoming more and more independent from the rest of the world. So my scenarios, taking multiple entry points, would be that the US dollar will weaken in the future, and could strongly weaken in the future, because also it's intuitive that with the increase of the US public debt, there will be a pushback from the rest of the world. I mean, non-American countries. Today, still today, the US federal debt is only is being carried 75% by US institutions, only 25% by the rest of the world. But long-dated bonds are being, pushed back by investors, which means that probably Trump will use the Federal Reserve to monetize the US public debt, short-term US public debt. That will lead to inflation, that will lead to a weakening dollar, and then you have a horrible circle, because you see at the same time US depreciation and US inflation, and the two go together. So it could be that in the coming quarters, I don't know, we see a strong weakening of the US dollar.
Is this in the interest of Trump in terms of attractiveness, or is it just very dangerous and something he wants to avoid?
It's dangerous because when you have a weakening currency, people do not invest in your country anymore.
Okay.
But at the same time, Trump is imposing a tariff and rates, meaning that he's telling people, if you don't come and invest into the US, you will be imposed taxes. That's one thing. Also, a weakening US dollar has the same effect as tariffs, because it means that your import costs more, you are able to export more, so it gives a short-term relief, like it did in 71. Because when Nixon debundled the US dollar and gold, that led to inflation, and that led to a 40% depreciation of the US dollar over the decade. And we could see the same. In the coming years. Of course, it helped. I would say it helped the US economy, but globally it was a loss to the rest of the world, including the US. So that's why people call that beggar my neighbor policy. You depreciate your currency, you get a short-term relief, but other people will be obliged, the countries will be obliged to depreciate their own currency, and then day by day you create imported inflation, fueling the currency depreciation, and it ends into a mess.
Yeah, and what's new right now with this bipolar world is that 50 years ago it was monopolar, so basically it happened, but everybody was in the same camp. Right now you could have some strategies to attack the dollar by, of course I would think about Russia first, but this whole BRICS group has a lot to talk about if we follow their meetings.
Yes, if I may interrupt you, it will take a while, because the renminbi is still a non-convertible currency. Although it's considered as one of the 5 reserve currency according to the IMF, it's still non-convertible. So even if you create a sub-monetary zone across the BRICS countries, the anchoring of the renminbi is still a long way to go before it becomes a credible alternative to the US dollar.
Yes, it's a bit asymmetric still, but I think again history comes into play. Of course, China remembers really well the 19th century. I don't think they want to do a lot of business with Great Britain right now, as they learned after Brexit the hard way. And there's a lot of colonialist history, a lot of feelings where there is a feeling this new pole wants to show what its economy is capable of, and so we enter waters we've never experienced over the past centuries. Let's have a look at scenarios in terms of risk and opportunities, and maybe we should start with Luxembourg. You've been working here for many years. How do you see the Luxembourgish economy in its diversification, in its resilience, and which opportunities do you see and which risks do you identify?
I'm not worried at all for the Luxembourg economy, because when you take a long-term perspective, the business case of Luxembourg has changed so many times, starting with agriculture and then steel and then the banking and then the asset management, that you see that it's a country that can reinvent itself all the time, attracting multiple people from many countries, where the level of productivity is very high. Also, you have this multiculturality that fuels, I would say, the prosperity of the country. So definitely, being at the border between the Latin and the German countries is a huge advantage for Luxembourg. On a short-term basis, you can have some ripples, like a real estate crisis, like sometimes negative growth. But I wouldn't be worried at all for Luxembourg, because you guys in Luxembourg are building also a country business case on all the mistakes the countries would make. If you take the case of Belgium, Belgium is one of the highest saving rates of the world. So intuitively, you could have thought that Belgium would be the epicenter of the banking world of Europe, that it would be there close to the EU to develop a huge asset management industry. You know what? It happened in Luxembourg. Because we made mistakes, because we didn't have a strategy. So basically, I'm not worried at all. Again, there will be short-term hurdles, but definitely I'm not worried.
Maybe a word about this. You've been here since the 80s, and so we saw finance start in 81 with the banking secrecy, so private banking kicked off. Then there was this miracle of investment funds, I'm thinking liquid funds, the UCITS, and we had a second wave which strengthened the growth. Then this reached, the growth started slowing down, and we went into illiquid funds in 2012, and we got more. What's next? Because now for 4 years, the AUM has been stagnating. What is the next wave of growth?
But the growth may not come from finance. It can come from private equity, it can come from private credit, but it can come also for other things. When you see the level of innovation in Luxembourg regarding the cosmic world, what's being built up here, you can think that in a world that will not be confined to the Earth, Luxembourg would be maybe the new center of the new world. So I wouldn't be worried for that. Because you know, Luxembourg has this ability to rethink its own business case, and at the same time to create economies of scales. So it means that the asset management industry is there to remain. It will remain a cash cow of Luxembourg, giving Luxembourg the time to rethink other things.
So if we look one step higher at Europe, at the European level, again, which risk do you identify? Do you see some countries being tempted to leave? Do you see strengthening? Do you see some subgroups?
I see the risk of disintegration because after 89, when the USSR fell down, we all thought that the Western model would be adopted by all countries. And in the first stage, it was the case, not anymore today. So some countries are pushing back on the old EU model. And we have a big issue. We have to finance what we call the social state in the context of aging population with a relatively decreasing active population, meaning that we have a huge social burden to finance without sufficient growth to finance that. So we have to go through the next 15 years under multiple constraints, ensuring a decent standard of living for an aging population, not raising taxes too much, because one way to finance social expenses is to raise taxes. They really push back on that. We have a huge level of public debt in some countries. That's also an issue. So we have to, I would say, muddle through multiple constraints.
Maybe one word about regulation. We know that over the past, since the subprime, basically, Europe went completely out of its mind and went far too much.
You mean in finance business? In the finance business?
Especially in finance, absolutely. And we heard Ursula von der Leyen in February say we went too far, but we don't see her coming back. Do you see a need to simplify, or do you think we can handle that?
I can understand what happened in 2008. I was at the time the CEO of the Belgian exchange market, and government got caught by surprise. They had to refinance banks. The savings of the European population was at stake, so it was a very important moment. And then banking regulation got strengthened day by day. But what we see today is that the financial risks are not in the banking sector anymore. They are beyond the banking sector, the non-regulated entities. And it's interesting to see what's happening in the US. They are starting to deregulate the banking sector, not because they think that banks are too regulated, although some people claim they are too regulated, but because the risk is migrated towards other places. And so some people say today that private equity and private credit may be riskier than banking credit, which means that the risk, put another way, the risk never disappears. It migrates from point A to point B.
Very interesting. And if we finish at the scale of the world, again, some risks, some opportunities?
The world has become nervous because every time a certain level of globalization has been reached, there's a pushback on that. Because, and intuitively, it's quickly understandable. It means that when people feel that they are being jeopardized by globalization, when people are afraid that their own job would be at stake because potentially taken away by somebody at the other side of the world, people are pushing back globalization. That's why Trump has been elected. Because although the US has promoted globalization and neoliberalism, he created, a fake storytelling, saying that because of globalization, jobs had been taken away from the US and exported to China. And so what I think is that the world will continue to deglobalize, certainly. There will be frictions all over the place, and we will have probably 10 years, 15 years maybe, of extremely low growth. Okay. Which means that asset prices, except if there is a wave of inflation, will not find the excess return that we could experience over the last 40 years. And
as an economist, would you recommend that we adjust the model? The Luxembourgish economy is built around the eternal growth of 4% of GDP per year. Should we just adjust this model because we know this kind of growth will not come back during a decade?
4% seems to me quite high because the Luxembourg growth rate is a linear combination of the growth rate of other countries like France, Belgium, and Germany. So I would say that 2 or 3% would be the norm. But we see that even for Germany, that used to be the most, I would say, aggressive country in Europe in terms of GDP growth, they will be close to 1 to 1.5%, meaning that we have to adjust to a new world. And again, we are entering into the cost of the aging population. And there's a correlation between two factors, a lower growth and an aging population, that you can experience from an academic perspective in the US. When you take the average age and aging population of several states, you can correlate that with the growth rate, and we will see the same in Europe.
So if I can wrap it up, I think the biggest danger would be now ignorance. That's why we need to listen to economists like you, because ignorance leads to social conflicts. Absolutely. And we all know, if we look at the history of Europe, that this doesn't help when you need to strengthen your economy. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.